In this next section, we're going to take a look at these items: authentication and authorization, encryption, and malware protection. Actually, in this video, we're going to be looking at authentication and authorization. These are all areas that need attention when securing computers. Now, unfortunately, this PowerPoint does not really define authentication and authorization. So before I get into the next few slides, I want to define those two terms more carefully. Authentication is what you do when you log on to a computer. It is proving your identity, proving you are who you say you are. There are typically two parts to it. One is a username, and then the other part is the password. So your username is really the identification portion of authentication. And then the password is really the authentication portion of authentication. So those are usually, or those historically, the two. Now we've since added some things. We've added things like maybe a number that comes up on your email, or that comes in as a text to you. We're going to talk about that in a little while. That is two-factor or multi-factor authentication, but it is still authentication in general. It's proving you are who you say you are. Now, authorization is a whole different thing. Authorization doesn't take place until after authentication. In other words, once you have authenticated, authorization is assigning you the rights to access various resources. So, for example, you can access certain printers or certain files and folders. That's authorization, what you can do once you're authenticated. So now we're going to look at several slides on authentication and authorization. Let's take a look. And by the way, you'll see that there are 12 slides here, but some of them have to do with Linux, and we are not going to deal with Linux in our lectures here. So, authentication and authorization are security features that enable administrators to control who has access to the network. That's authentication, who has access, and what users can do after they're logged on, their authorization. Now, by default, Windows uses an authentication system called Kerberos. Now, Kerberos is kind of a detailed, involved system that involves not only logging onto the system, but then a login ticketing system for the resources themselves. It's quite complex, and I'm not going to go to it in great detail, but I like to liken it to let's say when you go to the fair, right? You pay an admission ticket in order to get into the place. Now, once you get in, you go to various booths, and let's say you go to the rides section and you want to ride a ride. Now you have to pay for a second ticket to get on that Ferris wheel. Well, let's pretend for a moment that before you are allowed onto that Ferris wheel, that when you come in, you are given not only your entry ticket, but that entry ticket specifies what you can do once you're in there. And you would have to show that ticket and show that you have authorization to get on the Ferris wheel, or to get a Ferris wheel ticket when you enter. So now that you're in there, you have to show that as you buy that Ferris wheel ticket. Now, that used to be true a long time ago, many years ago, at Disneyland. You had A tickets, B tickets, C, D, and E tickets, and there were A rides. Well, they don't call them rides, they call them attractions. B, C, D, and E attractions. And so you had to have an E ticket in order to get onto an E attraction, and a C ticket to get onto a C attraction, and so on. That's a similar system to Kerberos. Kerberos allows you into the system, and then before you use a folder or a printer or some resource, you have to present that ticket that also allows you to get a ticket to get on the ride for that printer, right? And so that's kind of how Kerberos works. Kerberos is used throughout Windows when you're on a server system, a domain. Now, Radius is used quite frequently for dial-in, or today, of course, we don't dial in so much as we use VPNs. So Radius is used when you come in remotely and want remote access. So Radius is an authentication system for that remote access. Now, it can be used for other things as well. Radius is often used, for example, for Wi-Fi access in order to allow you to get on through a Wi-Fi system. But those are the two systems most popularly used for authentication, and usually on a local system you're using Kerberos, at least in Windows, and then for remote access you're using Radius. We have several groups of authentication systems that are available to us. One is EAP, which is really a conglomeration of others. So for example, SSL and TLS and PEAP, which, well, PEAP is actually a form of EAP, but it stands for Protected EAP. And these are all grouped in the EAP family of authentication types. They are a system of basically being able to send not passwords but hashes of passwords across the network in order to authenticate to each other. To say, yeah, I've got this password, and I'm not going to send you the password, but I will send you a hash of the password, and then you also have a hash of the password. We match them up, so the password is never sent across the network that way. Microsoft has its own system called CHAP, or Microsoft Challenge Handshake Application, MS CHAP. And there was an MS CHAP 1, now there's an MS CHAP 2. It is a similar system. I'm not going to go through the specifics of how it works, but it works by a challenge word, if you want. So we're going to send you, we're going to encrypt a word. I'm going to keep the encrypted version and then send you the word. You're going to encrypt it, and then we're going to see if they match. And if they match, then we know that we have the same encryption system. So that's kind of how that works, kind of, sort of. And then PAP, well, PAP is not really used much anymore. PAP used to be used for point-to-point links, and it turns out it's not very secure. It actually sends passwords in plain text, so we don't use it much anymore, but it at one time was used quite often for point-to-point links. Here's that multi-factor authentication I was talking about. We're seeing this more and more, where you have to get a code in your email, or maybe in a text, or maybe using a password system such as Google Authenticator. We used to have to carry around these little devices with us that would have a number that would change every 60 seconds. And if you wanted to log into your company network, for example, you had to have this device with you. But now we do it more typically on our phone. Multi-factor authentication means I need to not only know something, like a username and a password, but I must also possess something. Or I must have a biometric, they call it an inherence here, but what we mean by inherence is something, either could be something you do, a certain way that you draw something, or something that you are, for example, in a fingerprint or an iris scan, something of that nature that has to do with you personally, that's different from everybody else. It could be the way that you, the keystroke dynamics, so the way you type, for example. So we have these three. We usually call them what you know, what you have, and what you are. So those are the three kinds of authentication factors, and there are three of them: what you do, or what you know, what you have, and what you are. And so if you use any two of those, then you're using multi-factor authentication. When you're using just two, sometimes we call it two-factor authentication, or 2FA. Now in Windows, as in any network OS, now by network OS I mean a server, so to speak. Now Linux has its own groups. The most common Linux server is RHEL, which is Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That is a server version of Linux. Apple has their own, and one called Mac OS Server, or just Mac. I think it's just called Mac Server now. And so Windows has servers, Linux has servers, Red Hat has servers. So those are called network OSs. And network OSs have tools that are built in for authentication purposes. And I've mentioned before that Microsoft uses, and we went back, let's go back here for a moment to here, uses Kerberos for its authentication system. Now, other systems may use others, but we're not really that interested in those off the top of our heads here, or in this study, I should say. Windows OSs allow passwords of up to 128 characters. A minimum of 5 to 8 is typical. We're only, in this class, only interested in the Windows systems. Password requirements. There are several of these things that you can set up in Windows, but 3 that are particularly important, and that is a maximum password age, minimum password age, and password history. In other words, how many passwords do you have to use before you can reuse one again? Now, one of these sounds a little bit funny. Minimum password age. In other words, how long do I have to keep a password before I can change it again? Well, why shouldn't I be able to change a password immediately? Well, there's a reason for that, and that is this one, the password history. If, let's say that I require you to remember or to change your password 5 times before you can reuse the same password. Well, if I don't have a minimum password age, all you have to do is change your password 5 times and then change it back to your original one so that you're always using the same password. So we have a minimum password age to force you to use it for a certain period of time before you can change it again. You can change the password policies for a local computer in the local security policy console. You can change it on a server using group policy. Here on the next slide, you see just a screenshot of that. Here in security settings, account policies, enforce password history, maximum password age, minimum password age. Those are the most important settings here. Now here we have the Linux environment, and we're not going to dwell on the Linux environment, and I take out any questions specifically on Linux in the quizzes because we're not particularly interested in the Linux stuff. So we have several slides on that here. Now we have some password do's and don'ts, and this we have to be careful here because different companies and different people and different standards say different things. Using a combination of uppercase, lowercase, and numbers and special characters is one of the options we have. In fact, that's one of the options we have in Windows. If we were going to go back here, you see this must meet password complexity requirements. That requires a user to use at least 3 of those 4 things: upper, lower, numbers, and special characters. Consider using a phrase such as "I like computer security." This is actually not a bad one here. Don't use passwords based on your logon name. Windows won't even let you do that if you try to type it in. Well, depending on the settings, it often won't let you use your login name as part of your password. Family members' names, pet names, birthdays, and so on. Don't use any of that stuff. Bible verses, I see that one a lot because it has uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and then the colon, but they're so common that you probably shouldn't use those. Don't use dictionary words unless they're part of a phrase. Unless they're part of a phrase, that's an important phrase right there. Don't make your password so complex that you forget it. Now, this is one, when you turn on password complexity, sometimes you force people to make it so complex that they don't remember it. That is really a bad practice, and you should not do that. And then consider using a password manager app. So I use a password manager app. I use LastPass on my computer. There are also password managers built into your Chrome or Firefox, for example. Now, right now, the NIST recommends that you have a password phrase which is at least 20 characters long, and that you don't require complexity like these special characters and so on, and that you don't require it to constantly change. Because if you require people to change it every 8 weeks or 6 months or whatever, they're just going to put a 1 after it and then a 2 after it and so on. If it's too complex or if they have to change it too often, they're just going to write it down. So that's bad practice. So that's the current NIST standard. Restricting logon hours and logon locations. So most OSs, including Windows, have a way to restrict that, and the next slide shows that restriction. So I can, for any given person, I can restrict what hours they can log on and not log on. So this might be a good security system for your organization. So for example, if if you only work from 8 to 5, and I want to make sure that the janitor isn't in or some bad guy isn't logging on after hours, I can set that up to make sure that that doesn't happen. So that ends our section on authentication and authorization. We're going to take a look at encryption next.